Councillor Ruth Dombey, and I chair this committee. We've got a lot more experience now of virtual meetings, but just to remind everyone, when you're not speaking, if you could remain on mute, that helps with the recording and reduces the interference for everyone else. I'd ask all councillors please to turn their cameras on for now, so that in a moment I'm going to be asking Alexa Coates to call out the names of the people who are present, after which I'm very happy for all the councillors to turn off your cameras if you prefer, if that helps with your bandwidth, but I would ask you to turn the cameras back on again when you're actually speaking, please. And if you do want to speak, because there's a lot of us on this committee, officers and councillors, and I can't see everyone on one screen, if you could indicate on the chat if you'd like to speak, and then I'll be more than happy to bring you in. And finally, just to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded and also live streamed. So welcome everyone. I suggest we go straight into the agenda, and I'm going to ask Alexa Coates to confirm the attendees to the meeting and also if there are any apologies for absence. Alexa.
Thank you, Councillor Dombey. To confirm, I can see we have in attendance Councillors Dombey, McCoy, Aberlin, Batt, Crawley, Drummond, Foster, Garrett, Gordon, Haldane, Hicks, James, Pennock, Ramsey and Sakib, and that means there's been no apologies for absence this evening.
Thank you. So that means we have full attendance, which is excellent. Does anyone have any declarations of interest? If so, could you indicate, please, either visually or in the chat? I don't see anyone indicating, so I'm going to assume there are no declarations of interest. And can I approve the minutes of the previous meeting as a correct record? Some thumbs up or nods would be helpful. Yep, thank you. So those minutes are approved. In which case we'll go straight into the agenda, and item 6, update on the Council's response to COVID-19. I'm going to hand over to the Chief Executive, Helen Bailey. Helen.
Thank you, Leader. I will give a brief introduction and bring in a couple of colleagues to add to it, if I may. I think it's perhaps worth just pointing out to the committee that at the point at which we wrote this report and prepared it for you, we were at the end of the summer, and it felt that very much the focus was on lockdown. As we move into the autumn, we are now gearing up to cope with a slight uptick in the numbers of people getting COVID, and to prepare for the potential, although yet uncertain, consequences of that for us and for everybody else as the autumn goes through. So there are in the report some figures about the impact that COVID has had on the borough, and I will ask the Director of Public Health in a moment to say a word or two about where we now are. In terms of our own services, we are continuing to deliver the vast majority of our services online and virtually, as indeed we are with this meeting. But as this report indicates, other things that were closed previously, like libraries, playgrounds, outdoor gyms and leisure centres, have reopened insofar as they can. Now, I add a note of caution because this week we've had some extra advice from government about the way in which we need to record people's attendance at locations, as well as around the rule of 6 for people undertaking social occasions. So we will have to consider that in the way that we manage those facilities. We've been working with business, and businesses in Sutton have been reopening, although again, when we come to the end of this month, we will start to see the impacts of the longer term impact of the furlough scheme and how that plays out. But very much the big thing that has happened since our last committee meeting and our last report of this sort is that our schools and education settings have reopened for most of our pupils, or in fact for all of our pupils. And again, I'm going to ask the Director, Mr. Ireland, after the Director of Public Health has said a few words, just to say a word or two about how that has gone, because that has happened since this report was put together and not in time for us to be able to write anything very much about it now. I think as for previous meetings of this sort, this is a very comprehensive report. It sets out what we've been doing. It also starts to set out the plans that we have to continue to manage the usual business of the council as we go into a very uncertain autumn, in which we have to be able to continue to deliver services virtually as we are doing now. And if things improve, we will be able to open up a few more things. If not, we may have to revert to some of the tighter procedures that we were using during the course of spring and autumn. But without further ado, I will ask Dr. Chowdhury to say a word or two about where we are and about his outbreak control plans, and then to ask Mr. Ireland to say a word or two about school return. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Chief Executive. So just in terms of, you'll note the numbers in the report in terms of the weekly incidence rate. So just to provide some updated figures first of all. So over the last 7 days, we've really seen a continuation of that trend in Sutton. We've had about 23 cases over the last 7 days. We're continuing to see that slight uptick, particularly amongst the younger population and people in their 20s. And that, I guess, is not surprising given the kind of some of the easing of the earlier lockdown restrictions. Our positivity rate in terms of our tests has crept up a little bit to 1.5%. But compared to London boroughs overall, our rate of testing remains comparable. I won't say good, because clearly there's a national shortage of testing capacity, and there are some deep concerns around the availability of tests for residents. Nevertheless, that rate of 11 or thereabouts per 100,000 is not above the threshold of 20. So Sutton per se at the moment is not an area of concern. And I'm happy to note that in terms of hospitalisations within South West London, at least, there is no evidence of increased hospitalisations, and that's really, really important. We do continue to have a number of ongoing outbreaks in some care homes, and clearly over the weekend we had some incidents in some schools as well, but no outbreaks. However, I think what's more important is not necessarily the local picture here in Sutton, but for us to consider what's happening in London as a whole, because I think in terms of the transmission of the virus and the epidemiology, Sutton will very much follow the pattern across the whole of London. And there, unfortunately, the picture is bleaker. We're seeing probably around about half of London boroughs are now over that 20 per 100,000 threshold, which does mean that we are seeing a sustained continuation of that increase in cases. And while I don't think there's a sustained trend, we are beginning to hear from some areas of London that there are beginning to see a small increase in hospitalizations for COVID as well, and that is quite worrying. A mixed picture overall, certainly not as good as it was when this report was written first last time round. In terms of the outbreak control plan work, that work is ongoing. We're trying to keep the balance between getting the messages out there around individuals taking responsibility for their behaviour in terms of hands, face and space, trying to make as many people as possible aware of the need to isolate and get a test if they have any symptoms. And of course, the new rule of 6 that's just come in. Going forward, there's a lot of work in terms of the communication, both in terms of our settings, and we've done some really good work with our schools. And I think, I'm sure Nick will say some more, but actually the incidents we had in school and how well they were handled, I think is testament to the great work that's been done across a number of teams across the council in terms of communicating clearly with schools. And I was really pleased about that. Clearly, there's a lot of work that's going on and remains to be done around care homes, and there's a lot of joint up work going on across the council, but also with NHS colleagues. Again, the worry there is around the lack of testing capacity, providing challenges going forward. And over the coming weeks and months, we're working very, very closely with comms colleagues to make sure that we ramp up the messages and provide that clarity to the public and try to sustain some of that really, really positive behaviour that we've seen from members of the public, and particularly from young people, actually, because I think it's worth saying that actually young people generally have really stepped up and taken up responsibility and gone forward and got themselves tested, which is great, and we want that to continue. So perhaps with that, I shall leave it there, if that's okay.
Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury, and I'll bring in Nick Ireland, Strategic Director for People Services.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll give a brief update regarding schools. I'm very pleased to be able to report that all schools in Sutton have reopened and children are back in their education environment. This is the sort of result of an ongoing period of time of hard work that schools and head teachers have been undertaking in terms of their response to COVID, and the work across partners, including the council, in supporting head teachers, and in particular the heads coordination group, to ensure that all schools were ready for reopening. So some of the work that the council and other teams have contributed to has been health and safety risk assessments, some guidance around infection control, sourcing, helping schools source PPE, and of course there has been the sharing of guidance that has been provided by the government on a range of aspects of reopening and infection control, which we've worked hard to support schools with in terms of their application of that in terms of reopening. I'd just like to perhaps convey a point of thanks to members and other partners who I know have worked with schools in terms of encouraging the reopening and providing some positive messaging about that. I think that's gone a long way to installing confidence in the local community. So as of September, all our schools are open. Some have had a more staggered reopening, and that's quite normal for the younger cohort, particularly the reception year, as very young children get used to school for the first time. Just in terms of a kind of an indication of how successful that has been, schools have to do a DFE data return in terms of attendance, and I can say as of last week the attendance of children in Sutton schools in its totality was about 89% of the total cohort, which compares to the 78% nationally after the first week or two. So that's a real positive indication of the hard work and the approach taken to reopening schools. And just as a last point, I personally have been in touch with some head teachers, and I spoke with one on Friday, and the clear message was that children are happy to be back at school and pleased to be mixing with their friends and classmates. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ireland, and I'm sure there are many parents who are equally happy that their children are back at school because it's the best place for them to be. I know that the experience of homeschooling has been a revelation for many parents. I'd just like to start by thanking council staff. So, Ms. Bailey, if you want to convey our thanks back to the whole staff team. I think the response to the emergency has been absolutely extraordinary, both initially adapting to what has become a new normal, but also as time goes by, it certainly doesn't get any easier. The amount of work that's involved, the amount of extra work while we continue to keep basic services, routine services continuing, with the extra work that's required because of the COVID crisis and the degree of uncertainty, is troubling for everyone. Some people have adapted well to home working, some people struggle for personal reasons because of their own home situation. And I know as a staff group, while there may be advantages for some members of staff not to have to commute such long distances, I know that there is also a growing sense that we lack that sense of connection between the teams. And I know that there are plans in place to think about how we can have a staggered way of bringing back people into the workplace, recognising that, as Dr. Chowdhury said, the numbers are going up, and so we have to be very cautious and very careful. But I would like to thank staff. Obviously, the response has been from the whole community, from the many, many volunteers who have stepped forward, from all the different voluntary and community groups, and from all councillors, all 54 of us. Everyone has stepped up in quite an extraordinary way. And I think one of the things that comes up really strongly from the report is that strong sense of partnership within this borough. We've had feedback from many of our partners, whether it's the voluntary sector our health colleagues, our police colleagues, people who own shops, businesses. Everyone is saying that there is a strong embedded sense of partnership and that we are all working on this together. And I think that's really important. Feedback from different parts of the country is that where there is that strong partnership, things are going as well as can be expected. And the places that are struggling often because they don't have that sense of trust and understanding. I know that some of the barriers around data sharing have just vanished overnight. They've always been too difficult to manage, and now in the face of a crisis, suddenly solutions arrive. So I do think it is positive. I also recognise that the national situation can be very confusing for council staff, and I know talking to residents, they find certain aspects of what's going on confusing. Obviously, we are all in completely uncharted waters. None of us have lived through a global pandemic before, but I do think it's unfortunate that some of the messages coming out from central government are confusing and at times contradictory. For me personally, the latest one was about marshals on Friday. No clarity about exactly what their role should be. It's up to local councils, that's fine, I can live with that, but no enforcement powers. And first we're being told that they will be funded by central government, then they won't, and now we're not sure, and there will be an announcement made shortly. So I think this continued doubt and questioning is unhelpful, and I hope going forward there'll be more certainty about the way things are going to work. And I'd just like to pick up the point that Dr. Chowdhury made about testing, because I know talking to many residents and indeed to schools, everyone is concerned that with the need to increase the number of tests, the fact that there is a backlog of, I'm told, of 185,000 swabs across the country, and that the system is so overstretched it's having to send tests to laboratories in Italy and Germany. I worry what that will mean going forward, because as Dr. Chowdhury said, sadly the numbers are going up in London, and there is an ever more urgent need to ensure that people do get the results of their tests very quickly, so they know if they have to isolate, if their children have to isolate. The government understandably wants to get the economy going again, but if we don't have an efficient and effective testing system, I just really don't see how that's going to work. I was pleased to take part in a meeting with Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health, on Friday afternoon, and Dido Harding, who is in charge of the testing programme, was there as well. There were 4 or 5 council leaders there, and we made the point very strongly that the testing regime has to improve, and that has to happen quickly. And certainly Matt Hancock agreed with us and said that they were doing everything they could to improve the system. We also made the point, and I know Dr. Chowdhury will be pleased to hear this, that we need early access to data and information. We can't be making decisions about potential lockdowns in our area if we don't know latest data. So I know that Dr. Chowdhury is very well networked with public health, and he's already given us some of the data which shows that actually over 50% now of boroughs are over that number of 20 per 100,000, which means there is cause for concern. I saw on the latest league table, and I know it changes every day, that Merton is the lowest in London at 11.6, and then it's us at 11.7. But you know, obviously those numbers are as good as the information that's being provided, and I think it's the trend that matters, and the trend sadly in London is slowly but surely going up. So we all have to be very concerned. And so finally, on that basis, I'd just like to encourage everyone to be encouraging everyone they know to take advantage of the flu jab. Everyone in the NHS is telling us that certainly everyone over the age of 50 and anyone with underlying health conditions, it is absolutely vital that they take advantage of the flu jab. I'm not sure, Dr. Chowdhury, if they're available yet in Sutton. I haven't seen any publicity, but I hope it will be soon. With the restrictions around social distancing, it's going to take much longer than normal for everyone to get their flu jab, because we can't queue up in GP surgeries and local pharmacies for obvious reasons. So I'd like everyone on this call to think about ways in which you can encourage everyone who needs to make sure they do take the flu jab, because until there is a vaccine, it is actually the only vaccination available that can reduce the risk. Can't do any more than that. But certainly the flu jab, everyone is saying to me, is absolutely vital in these circumstances. And I know that there will be a lot of communications and public health information about that. Do you happen to know, Dr. Chowdhury, if the vaccine is available in Sutton yet?
So I've been told that due to supplies, the NHS is staggering the programme. So GP surgeries are first of all writing out to patients who are in the high risk categories, so people over 65 and with certain long-term health conditions. I don't know off the top of my head whether actually anyone's actually been vaccinated yet, but it's going to be pretty imminent if it hasn't happened already.
That's fine, thank you. And I've got a meeting with GPs later this week, so I'll be able to find out the latest situation. Please do remember your local pharmacy is a good place to have the flu jab. You can go to GP surgeries, but actually let's support our local pharmacies as well. So that's enough from me. And Councillor Gordon in the chat is saying, I assume that refers to the flu jab, Councillor Gordon. It will be available from the 26th of September. So I've got Councillor McCoy who'd like to come in, and then Councillor Ramsey. Councillor McCoy.
Thank you, Chair. I echo your thanks to staff for dealing with very difficult situation and bringing the community together and all our partners to address this. And I just particularly want to look at business recovery. Again, thank you specifically to officers for the work they've done there. And it's quite good to read in the report that, you know, business did seem to be having a bit of an upturn. I've certainly, as I've been out and about, things seem to be a bit busier. You know, lots of people milling about, but in a well masked up and in a safe way. So that's been good. But talking to local businesses at the weekend, they said that they'd seen a dramatic downturn in business sort of the day after the announcement of the rule of six. They said that it took a while to say what's gone wrong, and then they found out that people are suddenly being a lot more cautious as a result of that, and that was before it was even implemented. You know, it was even due to be implemented, which is obviously today. So you know, we've been working. We always knew there was probably going to be a second wave, or the risk of a second wave. But in light of, you know, this new sort of restrictions, what have officers been thinking about? You know, what more support can they give to businesses? You know, what plans have they got in place? I'm aware that all the government finance schemes have all closed and finished now, apart from the furlough scheme. So I'm just wondering if there's been any thought given to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll bring in a few more questions because I can see quite a few councillors would like to ask. So if officers want to make a note of the questions that they're able to answer, we'll take a few more and then bring you in. So I've got Councillor Ramsey and then Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question. I take your point about the council needing as much data as possible and accurate data. And I know cases are rising, but, you know, it's lower in Sutton. You know, if they continue to rise and things get worse and there's a potential of local lockdowns, have we thought about local lockdowns, how we would handle it, how we would communicate to residents and businesses? Are we already kind of preparing the communication, or are we comparisons between other councils? It'd just be interesting to know, you know, if we kind of have a contingency plan on that.
Thank you for that. And Councillor Foster.
Mine relates to the homelessness. I think 644 on page 19 said that you're anticipating an increase in services required from the 23rd of August, and the council's homelessness strategy was planned to be reviewed at the end of August. We're now in September, just wondering what the state of play is on that.
Thank you, Councillor Foster. So shall we take those three first then? The first question was around business and business resilience. Who's going to come in on that?
Shall I pick that up initially, Leader? Which is, as Councillor McCoy said, businesses were sort of reeling a little bit from the announcement just last week about how the rule of six was playing out. We are monitoring that reasonably closely, and we'll think about what we can do to encourage people to use local businesses. But the honest to goodness truth is we're also getting our heads around exactly what that rule means for social distancing and for the way in which we should operate in the high street, and anything we should do to encourage people in the way that they behave. So if I could say, you make a really good point, we will take that away and do some work on it and incorporate it on our next update, because by then I think we'll know whether or not things have played out as you anticipate. On the question about local lockdown Councillor Ramsey raised, I don't know if Dr. Chowdhury wants to say a word or two more, but we are giving, as part of our local outbreak management plan, quite a lot of thought to what we would do. We are learning lessons from other places, both those cities that have quite widespread lockdowns that have been very well publicised, and also some of the smaller local outbreaks. And we're working with our partners in South West London, and we've got an exercise in the next week or two, because it's very unlikely that any outbreak would observe borough boundaries very precisely, to explore the way in which we would work collaboratively, as you would expect, with our neighbours and partners. But I can bring in Dr. Chowdhury on that. And I think on the homelessness strategy, Councillor Foster, when we wrote the report, we were anticipating that also evictions would be starting, and that the rules changed on that, meaning that the urgency that we expected to have to look at this with is less than we feared. But I don't know if my colleague Mr. Latham would like to come in briefly on that. But I will just give Dr. Chowdhury a moment to say something about local outbreak management.
Thank you, Chief Executive. So so we have a local outbreak control group which meets regularly. We review the data every day. We meet with NHS partners and indeed Public Health England to review the data and where we're going. And as the Chief Executive said, we are increasingly less concerned about small outbreaks in a particular setting in the borough, and more concerned about a general rise of cases across the whole of London. And that's why, as South West London DSPHs and Public Health England, we're now regularly meeting on a weekly basis, thinking about this, and indeed Public Health England are thinking about plans within the published contained framework for how we could approach such an issue. And other cities such as Birmingham and Leeds have already been there. And in essence, there is a sliding scale of interventions, going from providing, if possible, more testing and more enhanced testing regimes, increasing the number of people who are eligible for testing, deeper engagement with the community, particularly if you're able from your data to identify which particular groups are driving the spike. The introduction of local restrictions, like we've seen up north, for example, in terms of the number of households which can come together and socialise, to finally and by this stage it would get to be controlled by national government, a full-blown lockdown in terms of where we were back in March and April. So there's lots of people thinking about it, and there's a sliding scale of interventions which are described in the contained framework, which London's using to kind of monitor and respond at this stage.
Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury. And just to add to that, as I said, I was at a meeting on Friday. There were 3 or 4 London leaders there, and we were talking, Councillor Ramsey, exactly about that, the importance of good communications. I'm pleased that the Mayor of London was there, because we have to have absolute clarity about his role in all of this, and what local lockdowns actually look like. As Dr. Chowdhury said, if it's an individual building, if it's a care home or a shopping centre or a school, that's something that should be dealt with absolutely locally. But London, because of its very nature, is interconnected, and so it's more likely that if we do have to go into lockdown, it's going to be done on a wider than a borough basis. So communications becomes even more important. And as Dr. Chowdhury says, there's a sliding scale of clarity about what we're doing and why, and what basis those decisions are being made. I think the learning from Leicester was that central government had access to data that local leaders didn't, and that's why there was a lot of confusion, because the data that they had said that the numbers weren't that high. They weren't being shown the Pillar 2 data, and as a result, when they were shown that data, they understood why certain decisions were being made. So thank you for raising that, Councillor Ramsey, that's very helpful. And Mr. Latham, do you want to come in on the homelessness point?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Very briefly. The first thing to say is on the 21st of August, the Secretary of State announced a welcome measure, which was to extend the notice period that landlords are required to give, except in cases involving domestic violence or antisocial behaviour, to 6 months. And he was explicit that was to protect tenants during the winter period. So in addition to what the Chief Exec said, that's another reason why we're cautiously optimistic there won't be the surge or the swell in numbers when courts, when courts are already active, of course. In terms of the second question from Councillor Foster, we are working on a review, Chair, Our plan is to bring that to the October meeting of the Housing, Economy and Business Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Latham. And I've got 3 more questions. So I'll take Councillor Batt, then Councillor Drummond, and then Councillor Sagib. Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so my question really is around testing. Obviously, you touched on earlier. It was obviously fantastic to see all the schools back, and I want to say thank you to all the schools for all the work that's gone into doing that. Having had 3 children at home myself, homeschooled, and I can see how much work the schools have had to put into this. But what I'm concerned about is the testing and the and I've been picking up on social media and locally that people are really struggling to get the tests. And if children can't get the tests or teachers can't get the tests, it really is going to put in jeopardy the return to school. I know a family in question who tried to get a test towards the end of last week. We're having real problems with the website. They tried to get a test through their employer, who's a key worker. But they were told that key workers are no longer being prioritised. And in their words, the system is buckling under the pressure. I understand that schools have been given tests, but they couldn't find a test at any of their schools because one school hadn't had any tests delivered to them, and another school, they had run out completely. I mean, it does really seem quite surprising that the government didn't see this coming. That it would be such a huge demand in tests. You know, children have gone back to school. Children, inevitably get coughs and colds, and without a good, effective testing system in place, this is going to mean pupils and teachers could unnecessarily be missing out on school. So really, my question really is around, do we know are schools going to be getting any more tests? Really, I think there should be a priority for schools to have them.
Thank you, Councillor Batt. Councillor Drummond?
Hello, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to echo the Chair's comments about children going back to school. And I know many of them, well, in my house at least, we're excited about getting back to school. But it's also probably worth pointing out that not all children want to go back to school, and some were very, very anxious about doing it. And I was pleased to see that on 6.16 of the report, that it seems that a lot of support has been given to schools, and that was encouraging. So obviously, the easier we can make it for the schools and for the children to go back, the better for everyone. My question is, I think it was for Council and Cognos, were these services that Cognos offered to the schools, were they free or did they charge for them?
Thank you, Councillor Drummond. And Councillor Sagib.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to ask about the business recovery. Specifically, I note from point 6.5 that £25 million worth of grants have been distributed now. The funding made available was just over 28 million. So that leaves nearly 3 million that has not been distributed. Could I ask why that has not been distributed? And I see that the scheme closes at the end of September. Could I ask also, have we inquired about whether beyond the end of September, whether we as a council can keep that nearly 3 million in order to continue supporting local businesses? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So the first question was on testing. Dr. Chowdhury, would that be you? Although it's about schools as well, so how you want to handle that with Mr. Ireland, it's entirely up to you.
So perhaps I'll start, and then Nick may have some added detail. So on schools, I'm aware that initially each school in the borough received 10 test kits from the Department of Health and Social Care. I believe that after some concerns raised through DFE, there has been a promise of some further deliveries. I haven't heard whether they have arrived or not, and in terms of the general sentiments about the lack of availability of testing, all I can do is agree in terms of the difficulty for local residents. I think that the important message is first just to try to reassure people. We have been given reassurance by the department that hopefully their capacity will match demand by the end of this month. So I really hope that comes about. And in terms of the messaging for residents now, it is please do persist. So if you truly do have symptoms, please do persist. And we've been told that after several attempts, people should be getting a suitable testing appointment through the national portal run by the department. But above and beyond that,
Sorry, Dr. Chowdhury, did you say 10 test kits per school?
Initially, yes, the 10 test kits per school was what was provided.
That's extraordinary. We're trying to encourage people to go back to work. If a child has symptoms, presumably once the 10 kits are gone, and I can imagine that will happen in the first week, then that child will have to isolate, which means the parents are home as well. It seems ridiculous. Is it a distribution problem, or is it a lack of supply? Do you know?
I think it's almost certainly a lack of supply, and generally, I mean, there's clearly a lack of supply, a lack of lab capacity in terms of people to do the tests, and there's also there have been issues with lack of reagents in labs as well. So unfortunately there are a number of issues at several different levels which make addressing this quite challenging.
I understand, and I saw the announcement from the Prime Minister where the target that he was setting himself was quite extraordinary if we consider that's where we are now. We can only hope. Mr. Ireland, did you want to come in specifically about the schools?
Yes, thanks, Chair, and I think Dr. Chowdhury has covered off the question relating to testing. Regarding Councillor Drummond's question, thank you for raising that. And yes, there's been a range of support provided through educational psychology for schools, whether that be just giving some advice on the types of guidance that they can develop in terms of supporting children back and the communication that's gone to families. The support attached to education, health and care plans is free as a statutory requirement. So that intervention by educational psychology where articulated in EHCPs is free. And then there has also been some further support and guidance where needed and where requested from schools for developing any social stories, where it may help some young people to kind of understand some of the changes that schools have had to apply in terms of setting up to be ready for them to be open, and to at the same time make sure that they are doing everything they can to manage the environment from an infection control perspective. There has also been some general advice on some of the indicators of any kind of mental health well-being issues that schools may come to see from children and young people who are returning to school, but schools are well versed in those areas. Thank you.
And Mr. Ireland, we're also part of a Pathfinder pilot, aren't we, in South West London, along with the NHS, where there is a mental health counsellor, I believe, in every secondary school, and 50% of our primary schools, and the plan is to increase to 100% of our schools. This was something that was put in place pre-COVID, and a very wise decision on our part, because as children start to go back, some of the pressures and the stresses and the uncertainties will play out in different ways. So having someone in the school that's able to provide support, I think, is really important as well. And again, that's free. Excellent. And then the question from Councillor Sagib on business recovery.
I think that's me, Chair, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Mr. Simpson.
Hi. So the original allocation from the government of about 28 million. So firstly, to say that that's kind of based on that's an estimate based on historic records of our business base. So quite often, as you know, a lot of that money was aimed at small businesses who receive small business rate relief, so they don't pay any business rates most years. So you can imagine that quite often businesses may have originally been on that register, ceased to exist a couple of years ago, and there'd be no incentive for them to tell us because they weren't paying any business rates. So that information was as good estimate as they could provide to allocate the money quite quickly, but wouldn't exactly match the numbers of business that we have eligible. So there are strict criteria about who got the 10K and who got the 25K, which we had to follow. We got, as you know, quite a lot of money out quite quickly, and it's been going out in dribs and drabs since, and it's slightly higher than it says in the report. It's now at 25.3 million. So, as I say, there'll be businesses that no longer exist who therefore wouldn't meet that, would have lower numbers than the government estimated. Businesses also could reject the money. There wasn't many who rejected the money, but one of the main reasons would be around state aid. So where we had more medium-sized businesses who might be a chain, whose rateable value was under 51k, they could reject the money because they wouldn't meet the state aid requirements. We've also, the government kind of a few months into the scheme announced a discretionary scheme as well, that's referred to in the report as well, which was 5% at 1.3 million, I think it is. So that's allocated out of the 28 as well, unless you'd used up all the money. So that's part of the reconciliation. We don't have any discretion to use, beyond the 5%, we don't have any discretion to use the underspend for any other purposes. There was about 90 businesses we thought would qualify, but just didn't respond to emails or phone calls. And they've been visited in the last 2 to 3 weeks since the lockdown restrictions eased by some of the revenues and benefits team. A number of those businesses just don't exist anymore, so they don't qualify. But about 30 or 40 do. They're now making an application, and we expect to get that money out. We will get that money out by the end of the month. So that will add about 400,000 to the amount we've spent. In terms of lobbying for can local authorities use the remainder, I think that's been done. I think Councillor McCoy was actually wrote to the government, but I think the LGA have done it, London councils have done it, a number of people have lobbied, and at this stage the government have said no to using any underspend.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. My understanding is that there was lobbying directly to the Minister for London, Mr. Scully, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Councillor McCoy, but I think the response back was that any money that isn't spent by the deadline will go back to the Treasury. And I think that's a great shame, because I think there are other opportunities here to give support to local businesses. I see that Councillor McCoy in the chat is saying that she did write via London councils, and sadly the Minister for London said no. And I think this is a wasted opportunity, because obviously we want our local businesses not just to survive but to thrive, and there's an opportunity there to give them some support. So I know, Mr. Simpson, you and your team will do everything possible to find ways of tracking down any businesses that haven't applied, or seeing what can be done to give extra support. But it does seem a shame that that money, which was put to one side, was ring-fenced for local businesses, is now going to go back into the pot. We've got 2 more councillors asking questions, and then I suggest we bring this item to a close. Councillor Hicks and then Councillor McCoy.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like some clarification over the COVID background data. You were talking about the problems in Leicester where the data wasn't available to local authorities. Does Sutton now have all the data it needs to be up to date with any changes in the COVID situation, or what data is missing?
Thank you, Councillor Hicks. And I was referring to a previous situation. Things have definitely improved since then. And it's the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 data, but I'll leave Dr. Chowdhury to reply properly. Councillor McCoy.
Thank you. I think it's important sometimes just to get the human feedback. I mean, we've got paper here with lots of data, but it's good to get the human stories through the of people's experiences through the lockdown. And it was the schools discussion around schools that reminded me of this. I bumped into a resident I know the other day. She has mobility issues. She's in a condition that puts her in a mobility scooter most of the time, and she also has a daughter who is autistic. And I've been doing some cases with her well before the COVID pandemic. And I bumped into her and I said, "Oh, how did you get on? How did you cope over the lockdown?" She said, "Actually, it was really good for me. My daughter was able to be taken into school for the whole of the summer, which gave her respite, but also enabled her daughter to not only catch up, but to get on top of her work. And it was such a benefit to her." So she just said, "It's been brilliant. You know, it's been really helpful. Couldn't have asked for more." And I just thought that's a lovely story and positive feedback. So thank you to those schools that made that happen.
Thank you, Councillor McCoy. That's really helpful. And I know as a governor of a primary school in the borough just how difficult it's been for head teachers and teaching and support staff generally, and they've really risen to the challenge. I think the best thing I've heard from my head teacher is she said we should stop saying that children haven't been learning over the last 5-6 months. There's been a lot of learning going on. It's just been a different sort of learning. So what they need to do now is to catch up on the curriculum, but the learning has been happening. It's been an unusual situation for everyone, but I liked her positive attitude, and I know that just like with many other schools, they are determined to ensure that our children have the very, very best opportunities and are working hard to make sure that happens. Dr. Chowdhury, would you like to address Councillor Hicks' question and explain a little about this world of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 that you've inducted me into?
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Hicks, I think it's fair to say that the data that we've received now is much improved than it was, say, 6 weeks to 2 months ago. We generally have really good data from a number of different national dashboards at the moment. I think the only data set we really don't have good eyes on at the moment is the contact tracing data set. So that's the data set which monitors positive cases and has a conversation with them about their close social contacts and then tries to track them down. That national service at the moment is able to have a conversation with about 80% of Sutton residents who test positive for COVID at the moment, and around about 80% of their contacts in turn are traced and given suitable public health advice. We've applied to become a borough to take part in locally enhanced contact tracing. So what we're hoping to do is that when the national team aren't able to identify a contact within the first 48 hours, local authority teams will be able to then use the local data which we have, cross-reference against that contact to see whether we can trace that individual locally, and that should hopefully enable us to perhaps boost our rates in terms of tracing contacts to above 90%, and certainly that's been the experience in other parts of the country. So I think that's the last part of the jigsaw in terms of the data.
And the app, of course, is being launched on the 24th. I know it's been trialled in Newham, so that's hopefully, possibly, we shall see, might help to make things a bit easier.
Yes.
So thank you for that. Some really good questions, and we've taken quite some time over this item, but it is obviously of urgent and immediate interest to everyone. So thank you for all the questions. If we can go to the recommendations, we're being asked to note and endorse the actions detailed in this report. Can we agree? Some thumbs up or nods would be helpful, or even in the chat. And everyone is agreeing. Thank you. And again, many thanks from all of us on behalf of our residents for the excellent work that the council is doing to see us through these very, very difficult and unusual times. So I'll now move on to item 7, which is an update on the medium-term financial plan 2021 through to 2023. So looking ahead for the next 2 years. And I'm going to ask Councillor Gordon to come in first and then hand over to Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank officers for the update of the medium-term financial plan 2021-23, which paints a vivid picture of the underfunding of local government since 2010. A 60% reduction in central government funding in real terms. This means that we now spend £200 less per resident each year than we did in 2010. The underfunding has presented a challenge for emaciated local authorities up and down the country to stand strong during this COVID-19 pandemic. That said, Sutton Council staff have stepped up to the plate and have looked after our most vulnerable residents during the first peak of this pandemic. Despite central government's platitudes, they have failed in funding local authorities adequately during this period. Central government did provide some funding to ease the financial pressure for Sutton Council and businesses. However, it was just a sticking plaster on a deep and open wound. As you can see in the papers before you, the funding is uncertain. Our budget gap is likely to increase due to pressures on services caused by an ensuing economic downturn, whilst this government continues to inadequately fund local authorities. Chair, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. Mr. Simpson, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Gordon. So the report provides the committee with an update broadly in 2 areas. So you have in front of you the expected financial outturn for 2020-21 on revenue and capital. And this committee has had an update regarding the financial pressures the council are facing as part of the regular COVID reports to the committee, but this provides a full picture of our financial position. Also, an update on the medium-term financial plan, and this sets out the updated position on the forecast budget gaps for 2021-22 and 22-23. So this has been a 6 months like no other. The table at 4.4 shows the expected revenue outturn for 2020-21, overspend forecasts across all parts of the council caused by additional costs and reduction in income. The overspend forecast for the year is 17.144 million. The key reasons for that position have been reported to this committee as part of the COVID updates, but are set out clearly in 3.13 of the report. The impact on our council tax and business rates, which is anticipated to be just under 5 million in this year, does not impact this year's accounts and can be spread across the following 3 years. As at today, the council has received 12.010 million from the government that can be used to offset against its overspend. In addition, we anticipate receiving 2 million from the government to compensate for a proportion of lost sales fees and charges. This would leave a net overspend forecast of 3.134 million for this year. At this point, we're planning on using £2 million of our available revenue budget, contingency and investor safe funds to reduce that projected overspend to 1.134 million in this year. Clearly, there's still a level of uncertainty in the forecast, given there is just over 6 months remaining of the year, and as you've just heard during the previous item, the context we're operating in. All steps are being taken to manage the budget effectively for the remainder of the year to avoid the need to draw down on reserves at year end. Any drawdown on reserves would need to be repaid over the period of the medium-term financial plan, therefore making future years' budgets more challenging. The latest position on the capital programme for the year set out in 4.11 and in Appendix B1, the committee is asked to approve the reprofiling of planned expenditure from 2021 to future years as set out in Appendix B2. Moving on to the medium-term financial plan in a little more detail. The council approved a plan in February 2020 based on the best assumptions at that time. This set out a budget gap of 7.8 million over the next 2 years. Given the impact felt over the last 6 months and the forecast economic projections, the report presents an updated gap. There is a high degree of uncertainty around a number of issues. The spending review, comprehensive spending review expected from the government in the autumn, the length and the depth of the economic downturn and the impact that consequently has on our costs and income, any future lockdown spikes that could have a material impact on our costs and income. Section 5 of the report sets out a range of projections around that gap, and it projects a gap of between 12.9 and 20.5 for the next 2 years. This is clearly an increase on previous projections and is likely to mean a much more challenging set of budget choices for future years. Finally, on our housing revenue account, Section 8 of the report sets out the latest position and updates on the transfer of the repair service from a partner, Mears, back into Sutton Housing Partnership. The report recommends we make an advance payment of £600,000 for the management fee for 2021 to help manage those transitional costs, which will be recovered back of SHP and future management fees over the next 2 years. This is affordable within the HRA's business plan. I'm happy with officer colleagues to take questions on the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. And I know that every council all across the country is struggling with the financial uncertainty. Again, you know, in a situation like this, clearly uncertainty is the name of the game. We are living through a pandemic and potentially one of the worst economic recessions that we've ever seen. So I absolutely understand why it's not possible to have any degree of absolute certainty about where we're going to be this time next year and the year after. But I do think it really brings home the environment in which local government has to work, the fact that we have to provide balanced budgets each year, which is absolutely fine, but we have no certainty about how much grant funding is going to be available or how indeed the redistribution of funding is going to be carried out in the coming years. And the idea that we have to make decisions now for next year, not knowing exactly what our finances are going to be, well, no one would want to run their business like that. It's something we've been complaining about. It's not just a problem in Sutton, it's a conversation between local and central government. But I think the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and the recession really bring this home. For the benefit of anyone listening in or listening afterwards, when Mr. When Mr. Simpson talks about a deficit gap of between 12 and 20 million, that is not a one-off figure. That means that we need to find ways of spending that much less every year. And while it's absolutely right and proper in my view that this year we take that money out of reserves, as Mr. Simpson explained, that is not something that we can do year on year, and anything taken out of reserves has to be paid back in. We are in a stronger position compared to many places, and that's thanks to our prudence, our foresight, and the way that we are very careful. It's also, I would argue, because places where they have much higher fees and charges than us, whether that's parking charges, leisure centre charges, and so on, actually are suffering more because they've had a much heavier loss of income. But I know that all local authorities are asked to do a financial return every month, and my understanding is from those financial returns across the country that the £3.6 billion, which is an awful lot of money, which the government has provided so far to local government, actually only takes us up to the end of May, last May, not next May. If we calculate the extra expense, the extra funding we've had to put in because of the COVID crisis, plus our loss of income across the country, that's £3.6 billion, which is exactly the amount that the government has been able to provide to local authorities, and we're now in the middle of September. So we have some real concerns, and we were hoping we would get a 3-year settlement this time, and again I understand with COVID and the recession that's more difficult, but this degree of uncertainty forces us all to make decisions without really knowing where we're going to be this time next year. And I'm sure we'll all be aware of the dire financial situation of some councils, including Croydon next door to us, and our worries about the future are extreme. So we'll carry on doing some lobbying. It's as much about restructuring the way that local government is financed so that we are more independent, more self-reliant, more self-sufficient, as it is about actually the quantum of money that is available. That's enough from me. I'm not seeing anyone indicate in the chat. Councillor Crowley, would you like to come in? And then, sorry, I missed Councillor James. I'll take Councillor Crowley and then Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me. Just to say, I was wondering about the IPP, the investment property portfolio, and where we are with that, because obviously one of the issues has been to do with people not going back into offices, maybe not needing as much office space. And I know that we've got now quite a large portfolio that we rely on for income. So I'd like to know about that. And I'd also like to know about part of the losses that we're seeing within the budget and within what's coming up is the inability in year 2021 to, I think it's not 2021, not 1920, sorry, I apologise, for savings to be made, the savings targets having been missed. So I presume those savings targets will then be just transferred over to 21-22. Can I have some guidance on that as well, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crowley. And Councillor James.
Thank you, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make a comment first, and then perhaps a suggestion. So our budget gap has, doubled as a result of the COVID expenditure. So we have received government funding, but there's a big gap between what we've received from the government and what we've actually had to spend. And, I'm sure everybody on here, including the opposition, would agree that, all that spending that we've done has been appropriate. So I'm just going to ask Councillor Crowley, as leader of the opposition, because I know, that sometimes you think it is good to work cross-party. So I'm just going to suggest that maybe looking at that funding gap, would it be a good idea if Councillor Dombey, you as leader of the administration, and Councillor Crowley, you as leader of the opposition, actually write to government and see if we can get some full cost recovery on that. I know that you've said some lobbying is already taking place, but I do think it would be really helpful if we could come together on this issue and see if we can do a joint letter. So I just asked Councillor Crowley if that's something that he'd be willing to do, and of course you as well, Councillor Dombey. Thank you, Chair.
Shall I come in, Ruth? Or
that's fine, Councillor Crowley. Yes.
Yeah, sure. You know, same as Councillor Dombey, who obviously has quite high-level meetings on a day-to-day basis. As she said, she spoke to Matt Hancock last week and was in a meeting with him. We also speak to MHCLG, and we lobby all the time. I mean, letters are great, but where do they really get us? What do you want to do? Put it in front of the electorate and say, look at me, I wrote a letter? The whole point here is actually getting things done. We need to do the open lobbying properly by meeting people. And if we can meet those people, possibly together, I don't mind meeting up with Councillor Dombey, with somebody from whatever office we've got to go to. That would be great. I just think writing letters is a bit of a platitude to me, I'm afraid, and we've had those discussions in council in the past, Councillor James. I would rather we actually try and get things done rather than write letters that, as we both know, in both circumstances, can get lost.
They can get lost, Councillor Crowley, but sometimes we don't even get replies. So I think some lobbying of our local MPs.
That is very true, Councillor Dombey, and we'll come on to that later. Thank you.
I think some lobbying of our local MPs so that they can lobby at parliamentary level would be helpful. I'd like to thank you for Councillor Crowley that you chased the 2 letters with the MP for Carshalton and Wallington. Clearly they were lost within his office somewhere, because I was able to show him the automated replies that I'd received to both, and I'm grateful to you for chasing him for those 2 letters, and I did in fact receive replies. I'm just sorry that the MP for Sutton and Sheen not only didn't reply to me, but also hasn't replied to your, I assume you've asked him to check why we haven't had responses, and sadly I haven't heard anything back from him. Given that those 6 letters over the last, it must be 15 months now, were actually based on council motions that were agreed at council. If you'd like to try again, I think it would be helpful. You say they are only letters, but actually they were written as a result of a council motion, and in one case, if I remember rightly, it was a suggestion from the opposition bench that we should write to the local MP. So I'm sorry that he's treating you the way he treats me, Councillor Crowley, but let's hope that we can get some responses, because I do think, if nothing else, it's polite.
I agree that we should all be polite to each other, Ruth. Chair.
I'll leave it with you, Councillor Crowley, to see if you can persuade Mr Scully to reply to your attempts to persuade him to respond to those letters. And Mr Simpson, Councillor Crowley raised 2 questions, one on the investment portfolio, and the other one about how we profile our savings going forward.
That's correct. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Crowley. So on the IPP, we will be bringing the annual report to the next meeting of this committee. So that'll provide some detail around the performance of the IPP for last year and the first part of this year. As you know, it has performed relatively well over the last few years, so we have created a bit of a sinking fund from some of that money, because we're always aware that with any investment there are risks, and therefore it won't necessarily perform how we expect every year. So that's one way. In terms of the in-year position, the 2 major areas where we're receiving less income than we expected are around Cantium House, where there's some voids in Cantium House at the moment, and the other major one is the Oxfam House, where there's a rent review due on April 2020, and we're anticipating, based on rents in that locality, we're anticipating a rise in the rent due. That rent review is ongoing, but we're less optimistic about the rise than we were in February this year, given the impact on the office market of the pandemic. So we have seen a dip in income this year. The portfolio has been very successful. We have a sinking fund to help us manage some of that impact. But Anne will be bringing a report to the next meeting of this committee, so we can have further further discussions at that point. On the savings, Appendix C is probably helpful. So Appendix C of the report has a list of all the savings that were in the medium-term financial plan that went to this committee in February of this year and then through full council. That has a 3-year profile of the savings. And there's a current revised profile there. So that's the starting point. Clearly, as we try and close the budget gap, I will be, with my team, pushing as hard as possible to bring those savings back as early as possible. At the moment, you'll see instead of 9.7 million of savings, the projection is about $1 million down, and it also spreads out over the following 2 years. So we do recover most of those savings, but not all. But obviously, the intention is to try and recover it all and to try and recover it as quick as possible. And we'll be working with fellow strategic directors and the rest of the council to look at those on a line-by-line basis, because there are different issues affecting different lines of those savings. Some are just about, we'll catch up and do it 3 months later. Other ones are about a complete change, I suppose, around the market in relation to parking. So there's a income line in there around parking. There's an income line in there around our investment property portfolio. There's a big savings line in there around adult social care, and clearly the environment that adult social care is operating is slightly different to the environment it was in February. So there's a lot of complex issues in there, but as a line, outside the meeting, if there's any particular lines on that Appendix C that members would like further detail on, I'm happy to do that offline. Chair.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. A comment from Councillor Pennick and then a comment from Councillor McCoy.
Well, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to agree with Councillor Crowley and Councillor James about the importance of lobbying at this present time. I mean, whether it's meeting with ministers or writing joint letters, and letters are important because they set out an agreed position, and that's very important, I think, in taking things forward with government. We need to remember we're in the middle of a spending review here with government, probably the most difficult one ever. Section 6 of the report sets out some of the future strategies that the Director of Resources suggests about how we might bridge the gap of 12 to 20 million in our budget. And when you read it and you think, yes, but this is 12 to 20 million, is this going to deliver? And you realise the only way that actually we're going to bridge the budget gap is by having additional funding from central government to fund the impact of COVID, as they said originally they would do. And that's what we need the spending review to deliver. But will it? Every spending review we've had, where do the cuts come? The cuts come largely in central government, in local government. And that's what we've seen in the past. The Chancellor has said we've got difficult choices ahead. So I would just simply urge all sides on this, really, to realise that, we've already heard the example of Croydon. Sutton is in a much better position than Croydon, but it's very close to home, and you realise the difficulties that local government can get into, and a budget gap of 12 to 20 million is a huge gap for us to bridge solely on our own local resources, and we must be dependent on central government to help us out here. So I think we do need to work together on this to see if we can actually persuade central government to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pennick. And it certainly came home to me with the information that Councillor Gordon gave us in her opening comments, that there is £200 for every single resident living in this borough, £200 less than we had in 2010 to spend on essential services in a situation, in a COVID pandemic, with the virus and an economic recession where people's needs are increasing, not decreasing. So I think it is quite shocking, and obviously this is something that affects local government all over the country. Councillor McCoy, you want to come in?
Thank you. Yes, it was on the savings issue that Councillor Crowley mentioned. Although it's relevant to the point you've just made, that figure in there struck me that over the last 10 years, £200 less per resident to spend in 2020 compared to 2010. And I think that was sort of, we were looking at that even before, that was just the austerity cuts even before COVID. But that brings to the point is the savings that Councillor Crowley is asking about that have had to be delayed. They were planned in respect of the ongoing government cuts, and they the forecast funding gap and budget gap going forward before COVID. Those were the things that we'd made because of ongoing budget gaps. And I mean, I've been a councillor now for 14 years, and the forecast in the medium term for the next couple of years, I've never seen anything so like that in all my life. Those figures are hair-raising, so quite worrying. But yes, I just wanted to clarify that those savings were as a result of we were going to make them anyway, or we're going to need to make them anyway. Just to pick up the point about letters, letters proved to be a tangible, proof of lobbying work that's gone on, and it is the norm for all the London councils collectively to write to ministers with concerns. It is formally, we do that as part of any consultations that are going on, government white papers, and for the local government association as well. So letters are recognised as a sort of a formal way of expressing opinions from a collective point of view. So I don't think we should dismiss the power of a letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCoy. I don't think, unless you want to, Mr. Simpson, I think those comments were well made, and I don't think there was a question in there. So I suggest we move to the recommendations then. So the recommendations are from 2.1 through to 2.4. Can we agree those recommendations, please? And on the chat, I'm seeing lots of people saying agreed. So those 4 recommendations are agreed. We'll now come on to the third item of the evening. There are no papers or reports attached to this, but certainly I've been aware over the last 2 or 3 weeks of increasing concerns from some residents about the traffic scheme proposals that are being suggested, proposed, both here, not just here in Sutton, but all across London and indeed across the country. And I can well understand why some residents are expressing their concerns. Trying to imagine what the impact will be is not easy. It wouldn't be easy in normal times, even less so when we're dealing with the impact of COVID, with more people working from home. Will more people be going back to work soon? Will there be more traffic? Will people be using public transport? There's a huge amount of uncertainty. And I understand that people are concerned that with some of these proposals, some of these traffic schemes, it's possible that their journeys could be slightly longer, and it's not clear what the impact will be on surrounding roads. The feedback that we've had from other parts of London where these schemes have been in place for some time is that yes, it takes time to bed in, but then the residential roads are quieter, safer, and there is improved air quality. I've seen some data from Waltham Forest where they've been able to quantify the improvement in air quality. That doesn't obviously mean that it will necessarily happen here in Sutton, that's our aspiration, but we need to see going forward if we do manage to arrive at such a beneficial outcome, because these are trial schemes and we will be monitoring how they're going forward if they are successful. And we have been very clear from the beginning. We were clear as councillors, and officers are also clear, that if these schemes are not successful, if the data shows that actually they haven't achieved the aim that we hoped for or have just moved the problem elsewhere, then we will be removing them. They are trials for 6 months, but we will be monitoring them on an ongoing basis. I know that there's going to be a fuller debate at the Environment and Neighbourhoods Committee on the 1st of October, where they'll be discussing the petitions in some detail. But I did think it would be helpful this evening if we could talk through some of the wider issues. Remembering that, of course, I think it's the last 2 meetings, we've had some quite substantial, in-depth debates and agreement cross-party about the principle of trying out these trial schemes. Obviously, at the time, we didn't have the sort of details of where they were going to work exactly and the precise details of where they'd be going in. But there was agreement cross-party that this is something that was worth trying, and I know that many other London boroughs are doing the same. One of the things that we discussed very strongly at our previous meetings was the importance of good communications. And I have to say I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that the communications haven't happened as well as we had asked, as well as we had expected. Our residents expect more of us and we expect more of this council. And I have to say my disappointment, which I've already expressed to officers, runs quite deep. I know that the Chief Exec will wish to come in on that point later on, but I am going to hand over to Councillor Abelan now to ask him to give us an update on the situation. Again, we're not going to go into the details of individual schemes because that will be dealt with at the Environment Neighbourhoods Committee on the 1st of October, where there'll be an opportunity to look at the petitions and speak with the petitioners. But I know Councillor Abelan would like to make some general points, and I'll hand over to him.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll repeat some of what you've said, but I think it's important that members and the public hear it from me as lead member on this project. As you said, the item was discussed at this committee on the 6th of July, and members approved cross-party the principles of delivering low traffic areas and school streets to keep our children safe. Members also approved cross-party the specific schemes that we received funding for. They were included in the papers. It's interesting, actually, that on this agenda, the Conservative government, the Labour London Mayor, and our Lib Dem Council share a common position. This is quite unique in today's very polarized world. And there is so much agreement on this because the potential benefits for our residents are very important. During lockdown, many people across Sutton experienced better air quality and a safer environment with fewer cars on the road. The world is still very uncertain, but many agree on the need to preserve these benefits. The key question, I believe, for members to ask themselves is the following. What type of residential areas do we want for Sutton? Are members happy to keep the status quo? In certain residential areas, this means turning a blind eye to thousands of cars rat running to try and save some time on their journey, and pumping toxic fumes directly into people's bedrooms. Every individual will look at their own circumstances, but my role is to look at the bigger picture and at the interest of all local residents. I struggle to believe that it's in our collective interest not to try and address issues in areas where residents have complained of speeding, excessive traffic, noise, and poor air quality for far too long. This funding gives us that opportunity to try and improve people's lives. In November last year, some of us visited another London borough that has implemented, as you said, low traffic areas for many years now, and the benefits are clear. Improved safety with less traffic and speeding, improved air quality for thousands of residents in residential areas, less noise and more pleasant, greener, and roads that allow those who can to walk and cycle, especially for those short journeys. In normal times, we would have carried an informal consultation to gather initial views and then carried out a statutory consultation. Listening and working with the community to deliver the best possible schemes for our area is central to how we, Liberal Democrats, operate in Sutton. That's why, in comparison, when we can do it our way, residents are being consulted 3 times during our parking strategy program before anything is implemented on the ground. However, the government and London Mayor decided that boroughs would not consult residents before any trials and that the 6-month experimental trials would be used as a public consultation. In June, I had 2 choices. I could recommend to my colleagues that we boycott the process because we don't like it, or we could engage, secure some funding, and trial schemes. Personally, I didn't get elected to sit on the sidelines, and I'm happy that the majority of my group agreed with my view. My steer to officers was clear when they were putting together the bids. It was to focus on areas where the council has carried out public consultations on this issue and on traffic improvement issues before. That's why a majority of our proposals are in and around Sutton Town Centre. Where this was not possible, officers recommended areas with historical problems or where we had plans to consult in the near future. Because this is a priority for the administration, I also asked senior officers that enough resources were made available to give us the best possible chance of success. I was provided with those reassurances, but over the summer, it has become clear that there are still a number of operational issues that need to be addressed. I am frustrated, like many, that communications with ward members have too often been poor, that key elements of the website are uploaded too late. This is making it difficult for us as politicians to explain the schemes to residents. that the implementation of some of these schemes have not entirely delivered the materials and signs that were promised and agreed. That when amendments to schemes have been agreed, like at the last meeting on the 6th, it is taking too long to make those changes. We also need more clarity from officers about what will be monitored going forward. Over the coming weeks, I will be continuing to push for these issues to be resolved and have asked senior officers that this is investigated urgently. It's important also to acknowledge that officers put together a year's worth of work in just a matter of a few weeks. I know that there's a lot of anxiety from residents across the borough and many who are skeptical about the schemes in their areas. I understand this anxiety. I look forward to hearing, as the leader said, from some of those individuals on the 1st of October at TNN, and I will continue to engage with those residents who have written to me in the past few months. Given the potential benefits, I continue to welcome the trials, but I will be monitoring the situation and pushing for any adjustments when necessary, including lobbying for more money if needed. It's important to remember that TfL have said that this funding is the only highways and transport funding that we will get for the next 6 months and possibly longer. But ultimately, we should and we will keep the option open to remove the schemes that do not work. As I've said on multiple occasions, these are trials. It may take some time for some of these schemes to bed in before residents see the full benefits. So I hope that you will all bear with us in the first month. I also encourage you to give your views using our website once you have seen the impact in your area. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Abelan. And the Chief Executive, Helen Bailey, is asked to be able to speak.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for bringing me in. I'm grateful for coming after you and Councillor Abelan, but reflecting on the situation around these schemes, I just wanted to take this opportunity to apologise as Head of Paid Service publicly to you, to Councillor Abelan as Chair of Environment and Neighbourhoods Committee, and to all councillors for the way in which these schemes have been implemented and managed. I think you've highlighted in what you've both said that there have been issues of capacity, implementation and communication. And I recognise those, and I recognise that your disappointment is shared by all members of the council who have not had the information that they need and require. In our system, when a course of action is proposed, councillors have the right to expect timely, professional and thoughtful advice before they support it, and that decisions once made will be implemented accordingly, and where there are deviations, they will be explained or remedied. All councillors should also be able to expect the communication which is timely, relevant and comprehensible. And you have not had this. I recognise that the opportunity to undertake these schemes presented itself, as has been said, at short notice when the council was heavily committed with managing a pandemic, and that the funding conditions and the aspirations of national and regional government meant that processes which normally we would take months over did not get the time consideration that they needed. I also recognise that road management schemes are necessarily about balancing competing interests and priorities. Debating and resolving those competing interests is absolutely the stuff of politics and not the subject of my comments. But I do recognise that in order to do so, residents and councillors need high quality information at a time that they have the right to expect it. In saying all of this, I want to reassure you that the Interim Director and I are addressing the issue and ensuring that the lessons of the last few weeks are being learnt. A review is underway of the management of our highways service, which is a joint service, and in short order we are putting arrangements together to support that service until the outcomes can be taken forward. I am also in some difficulty about saying much more of that because of the impact on individuals, which I can't discuss here, but I do want to give you my absolute assurance that the Director and I are working on that at this moment and rigorously. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Bailey, and thank you for those words. I'm glad that you recognise that the level of service that's been provided has not been up to our normal standards, and I know that you and I will have many opportunities going forward to see that, to understand the lessons learned and to ensure that the standard is improved as a result. Councillor Garrett, you'd like to come in?
Hello, yes, thank you very much. So I have 5 requests, I think. I'm just reflecting on those in my mind, having listened to the quite extraordinary statement from the Chief Executive. So I'll come to the 5 requests in a moment. So we've had 2, as you say, Councillor Dombey, we've had 2 discussions about these items at the June and July Strategy and Resources Committee meeting, where we spoke about the potential benefits and potential problems of these schemes. And we all know that inconsiderate school parking and rat running through residential roads is definitely a problem. That's not an imaginary problem. Lots of people do contact us about it. At those 2 meetings, I proposed 4 changes, which I thought were very sensible and which were accepted by the Liberal Democrats as opposition recommendations. They were that each scheme's purpose should be clear. It should deliver the purpose that it sets out to achieve. We should make sure the public are clear what we're trying to achieve with each scheme, and that we monitor the ongoing impact of the schemes. And the reason I proposed those was because I was worried that what we would see is a lot of random things happening, stuff going on, a sort of scattergun approach, ignoring problems and leaving everyone confused without any real purpose. And at the risk of dubbing myself Councillor Cassandra, the reason I asked for this item tonight was precisely because over the summer, that's what I've watched unfold. As the opposition group, we approached this quite constructively at June and in July, and honestly, I don't really see how we can continue with a constructive cross-party approach on it. People just don't know what's going on. People out there, residents in their road, people trying to travel around the borough, they don't know what's going on in their own area, and they don't know what's going on further afield. We had perhaps one of the issues that was referred to earlier, we had a consultation, so information going out to residents with the wrong map. So they were in one street and they had a map of a completely different area. And it feels to me that while there has been some fast, efficient communication, that has really only been with the cycling groups, and everyone else has been left in the dark. And when that communication with the cycling groups came to light, I think it's a really good example of how bad communications, and let me be clear, bad communications from Liberal Democrat councillors, not from officers, has sowed mistrust and undermined the scheme. And speaking for myself, I was quite sad when the cycling forums where this information was coming out were made private, because that was actually the best source of information that I had as a councillor as to what was going on in the borough. For example, that's where I learned that the council were deliberately delaying the webpage with the information about these schemes where people could give feedback, because they didn't want too much negative feedback early on. My worry, again, reflecting on what the Chief Executive has just said, my worry, which I know we all felt as the opposition group after a briefing that we had on Friday with officers, I think while officers were very diplomatic about the situation that we're in, I came away, in my mind, very clear that officers are stretched far too thin. There are far too many schemes. I think we overbid. Nothing wrong with being ambitious, but we had more schemes come back than we were expecting. And now we have a relatively small group of people trying to implement an extremely large amount of schemes. And I think it was really a lack of political leadership to try and give officers a more realistic situation, a more realistic challenge. And frankly, I'm appalled at the criticism from the leader of officers, and I'm stunned at the comments from the Chief Executive, with officers lining up to be shot, it seems to me, for problems that, in my view, were not entirely of their making. I think they were put under too much pressure and left in a situation where mistakes were almost inevitable, compromising quality, rushing, and just leaving everyone confused. And I realise we don't want to talk about individual schemes, but it's almost become totemic. The cycle lane around Sutton town centre, the purpose of that was to find out whether there's demand for a cycle lane in that position. And it's been in there for months, I think since May, and we still have no idea whether there's demand for a cycle lane there, because nobody knows that it's a cycle lane. Nobody knows. You see people cycling on the one remaining traffic lane because they don't know that the coned off area is not supposed to be pavement. There are no signs. And the 2nd of June, I emailed quite strongly pointing out these problems, and nothing is happening. And so we've had this pointless situation of months of this scheme being in place, an entirely wasted opportunity to find out whether there's actually demand for this thing, and we still have no idea. Nobody knows. And I worry that if that's going to be the approach with all of the other schemes, like the schemes that went in, we've seen today some quite early feedback from residents about the schemes in Sutton North around Grenell Road and Greenshaw. The instant reaction is not very positive. And if the response from the Liberal Democrats is the same kind of blank reaction that we've seen on the town centre, it's difficult to see how any of those schemes are going to succeed. And so, as I say, inconsiderate parking around schools and rat running are real problems. But just randomly closing a bunch of roads without very little warning, confusing everyone, refusing to adapt and ignoring feedback from residents, I don't see how any of that is a recipe for solving the problem. And frankly, heaping all the blame for it on officers, I find a despicable approach, and so our issue as an opposition is that we approach this in good faith with cross-party support. But what we're seeing is officers overstretched with too many schemes, residents who don't know what's going on, what is supposed to be an experimental traffic order, but without any adaptation and feedback, Liberal Democrat councillors keeping a low profile. And my feeling is that you're just lining up to blame the government, the mayor, officers, as we're seeing tonight, the general public perhaps for not understanding it, or the opposition when your schemes flop. And frankly, my view is that if the Liberal Democrats who run the council are not willing to go out and publicly defend their own schemes and what they're doing, then I'm damn sure that I am not going to do that. And so this is why I think the cross-party support for this approach has to end unless we can actually see some tangible improvements. So here are the 5 specific things that I would like to see. Firstly, I think you have to consider fewer schemes just because of the officer capacity to do them properly. There is just no point doing them if we can only do them badly. Secondly, some clear criteria on how you are going to judge whether a scheme is a success. Thirdly, almost a hypothetical really, I'm curious to understand whether there is any level of public opposition and outrage that would actually lead to you removing a scheme. And in particular, I'm thinking the people within the low traffic neighbourhood are supposed to be the beneficiaries, the people whose roads have these closures added. If even they hate them, then it's difficult to see who is supposed to be the beneficiary. And fourth, what is the plan to try and rebuild the trust that was so damaged, for example, with this back channel communication with the cycling groups, while not really talking to anybody else? And fifthly, related to that, what are the tangible actions that you're going to take to communicate better with the public about what is going on and in their area, what it is that we are actually trying to achieve and how they are supposed to adapt, for example, what the planned alternative route they're supposed to use is meant to be? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garrett, and you have raised a lot of points. I will be asking Mr. Latham to come in, but before I do that, I'm going to take, as I said before, the substantive debate will be at the Environment and Neighbourhood Committee on the 1st of October, but both Councillor Batt and Councillor Ramsey have asked if they could pose a question. So I'm going to take both of them, and then I'm going to hand over to Mr. Latham and Ms. Bailey if you want to come back in. So, Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I have 2 sort of specific questions around, I think, actually are pertinent to all of the schemes, and something I think that residents across Sutton would be interested to know about. So the first one really is around sort of data. You know, some members I know have been asking for some information around cycle counts, traffic counts, and bus times for many weeks, and this information hasn't been forthcoming. So what can officers do to sort of work with ward members really to make sure we receive this information in a timely manner and that the information is accurate? And the second question, which I think is also really, really important for the schemes that have already been implemented and the ones that are due to be implemented, is whether amendments can be made to the low traffic neighbourhood schemes. For example, I've seen many suggestions have put forward, such as time closures and exemption of certain vehicles. I think it's important the schemes can be flexible and respond to the issues which occur as they are implemented. And can officers provide any clarity on this, please?
Thank you, Councillor Batt. And Councillor Ramsey?
Yeah, thanks. I think Councillor Garrett's probably asked most of the questions that I had. But Councillor Abalan, you mentioned clearly that these are trials. And you will be listening to residents, you said, and they can be removed if possible. But at what point, you know, how much resident feedback do you need to say, okay, these are going to be removed? And what are the timescales? How long are we expecting a scheme to be in place before we say, okay, these are not working, we're going to remove them? Are we talking a week, months? It'd be just good to know kind of genuine timescale.
Thank you, Councillor Ramsey, and I will bring you in, Councillor Drummond, and then I'm going to hand over to Mr. Latham to answer some of the technical questions, and then hand back to Councillor Abalan to answer some of the wider questions. Councillor Drummond.
Thank you, Chair, and sorry for coming in so late. I do agree with a lot of, well, with everything, in fact, that Councillor Garrett said, particularly around the comms. I mean, to be honest, I just do not understand what's going on. And I won't talk about one particular scheme, Chair, as I know that's not what you want me to do. But what I will say is, if there was a scheme and 2,500 people signed a petition for that scheme not to go ahead, I wouldn't be spending public money on it. I would be listening to those people. Okay, we didn't engage with them, but they certainly engaged with us. So I have no idea why we're doing this. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Latham, start with you. Ms. Bailey, if you want to come in as well, very welcome to do so. And then we'll finish this discussion with Councillor Abelan addressing some of the points that Mr. Latham hasn't picked up in his comments. Mr. Latham.
Thank you, Chair. Shall I start with Councillor Garrett, as he started first, Chair? 5 points that were made. I'll start with the last first, if I may, because in a sense that is the clearest challenge from a resident perspective, dare I say, which is tangible actions to improve local communications and assist people with alternative routes in their area. And I don't have an immediate response to give in terms of the specifics, and we're not talking about the specifics of individual schemes, but I think that is an objective we should aim to achieve. I won't comment further on the assertions about trust and back-channel communication. Any level of monitoring will lead you to remove a scheme. I think that ties in with the question, if I can link the two, that Councillor Ramsey also posed. We are too determined, and I think the success criteria, which was Councillor Garrett's first point, his second point, will enable us to determine this. I think what I would say is it is incredibly difficult, because we do not possess crystal balls, to predict the pattern of driving in these low traffic areas, as we have called them, low traffic neighbourhoods. And I think the fifth point that Councillor Garrett made is linked to that, which is to try to build more confidence with residents through enabling alternative routes to be chosen. So I think there's a clear need for us to do more on that. But in terms of the period, just to reinforce the points that have been made earlier, experimental traffic management orders have a 6-month duration. It's clear from all the guidance that we received, both from the Department for Transport and from TfL, that that is the period when we receive responses, we receive the views of residents in terms of which aspects of the measures that we have implemented they like or do not like, and why. And it's worth remembering, Chair, if I may make this observation, that most of the low traffic neighbourhood schemes, if not all of them, entail 20 mph extensions beyond those that are in place already, in addition to the other measures involving vehicle access closure. So I would say that we do not, as of this evening, have a straightforward answer on the question about at what point would we determine that we need to either amend or change or remove a scheme. But those are all factors that we will remain in dialogue with ward members about as we implement the schemes. The first point that Councillor Garrett made was there should be fewer schemes. Well, there are fewer schemes now than there were at the outset of funding awards due to decisions made already in the early stages of the process. And I will perhaps just return now to Councillor Batt's questions on data and amendments. I think the point about data is incredibly well made, Chair. I think that, in addition to communication with residents, is probably the most important issue where we have failed members at ward level, and that is a key task to address as speedily as we can, so that there is more comprehensive information which we can share at local level. There was mention made in particular of cycle data, bus data, and traffic data. All of those are important. The second question was around Amendments, I think I've already addressed that point, Chair. Yes, our intention is that it will be possible to amend or ultimately to decide to remove a scheme, and that is something that I need to work urgently on clarifying the criteria for, and at what point we may consider amendments, but it will be possible to make those. Councillor Drummond's question was more an expression of frustration about not understanding what is going on. We are planning to organise a briefing later this week for the 3 Worcester Park ward councillors about one of the schemes that is still to go live, to discuss the detail of that and the monitoring arrangements for that. Perhaps I'll pause there, Chair.
Before you do, Mr. Latham, so Councillor Crowley would like to ask a quick question about data, which I'm happy to take. And then if you would address the extraordinary assertion from Councillor Garrett that somehow we've held up the ability to provide feedback on the website. My understanding is that as soon as the schemes are live, then the link is live so that residents can start to provide feedback. So we'll take the question from Councillor Crowley quickly on data, and then if you could address the issue of the website as well, and then I'll bring in Ms. Bailey and then Councillor Abelan. Councillor Crowley. We can't hear you, Councillor Crowley. You're not muted, so I'm not sure why, but I can't hear what you're saying.
Any better?
That's better, thank you.
Thank you. Right, we know that data is incredibly important to the outcome of these schemes, which means that when we ask for data, when data is given out, then that data needs to be accurate. Now, there's been emails flying around over the last 2 or 3 days with certain councillors putting things out to residents saying X thousand cars have gone down a road here or 2,000 cars have gone down a road there. But we have no guarantee that that data is correct. And if we're putting out data that is incorrect, then I would assert that is in breach of the Nolan principles of government. In other words, we are putting stuff out that we can't say is correct. And I am urging all councillors from whatever party to ensure that any data that they put out is fair and accurate. For instance, we haven't got any air pollution data yet. So for Councillor Abelan to turn around and say, oh, our air data is going to be much better, we don't know that because we haven't set up any of the air quality monitoring stations properly yet. So therefore, we need some baseline data. I've been asking for this for 4 or 5 weeks, and I'm just getting blanked, and so are residents. And I'm just urging, please, Chair, please, 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 could you please ensure we get fair and accurate data? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crowley. And I'm going to ask Ms. Bailey to answer the data question. But first, Mr. Latham, could you address the assertion made by Councillor Garrett about the website, please, and when residents are able to provide feedback about the schemes?
Yes, Chair. The intention, as with today, is that the feedback is immediate. So when the scheme goes live, feedback can be provided immediately. I think it's fair to say that one of the failures with the schemes that went live last Monday, so that's the scheme in Kings Lane. I know we're not dwelling on the individual schemes tonight, Chair, and the scheme in North Cheam. There was a 3-day lag. So rather than being live on Monday, it went live on Wednesday morning. But our intention is to ensure that the consultation and the survey, the link to the consultation and the survey that residents complete, including their entitlement to register a response to the statutory consultation, which is in place now when the experimental traffic management orders go live. That is in place as soon as the schemes go live. And that is what we're planning for the 2 schemes that are due to go live next Monday. And it's been the case this week, if we dwell for a minute on the School Streets programme with those, and will be the case for the 2 following weeks when the 2 following phases of School Streets measures take effect.
Thank you, Mr. Latham. And Ms. Bailey, if you could address the issue of accuracy of data, but also baseline data.
Thank you, Chair. I will do my best. So I think where I should start is by saying I absolutely agree that where the council is producing data and providing it either to councillors or to residents, it ought to be accurate data and we ought to have confidence in it. Some of the data that has been produced has had challenges around it. Shall I put it no stronger than that? And I have asked, and Mr. Latham has asked, that any other data that goes out to anybody is double checked. And that is what we are in the process of doing, because I'm conscious things have come to light where we have provided the information on one premise when another was in fact the case. And that, to be clear, councillors, is why I chose to say to the committee what I said earlier on, and what Councillor Garrett said was an extraordinary statement, because it is clear to me, having got involved in this in the last few weeks, that we have not done as we should have done as a service. So what I would like to say to you, Chair, is I'm conscious of that. I accept the point that data should be accurate. We are double checking all of the data we put out. We're double checking all of the communications, and we are making sure that we get things into line going forward.
Thank you, Ms. Daly. Councillor Aberlin, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll address a few of the points. There is the point on fewer schemes, as Mr. Latham has acknowledged. We have fewer schemes than we originally bid for. 2 less school streets and a few of the low traffic neighborhoods. The York Road one that has gone out has been suspended. In terms of clear criteria, I think the criteria is there. Where we need to improve and we need more clarity is in explaining what the criteria will be and how it will be monitored and so on. And that's a point I've made to officers quite clearly. The point that both Councillor Ramsey and Councillor Garrett made on what does it take to remove schemes, you can't really put a number on that, and you can't really say have a specific sort of figure on all the schemes. You need to judge them individually. Each scheme is different, and I don't think we should treat them all exactly the same. I think we're keen to see how the schemes work on the ground. We need to let them bed in. We need to assess progress based on a mixture of resident feedback, which will be important. And as soon as each scheme goes live, there is a consultation page on the website that is opened. I think it's been improved in the last week, how the pages look like, and hopefully we'll continue to improve them. And then also with based on data like bus times, traffic counts, cycling counts, and so on. I think we just need to make sure that ward members and residents are clearer on that, and that's a fair point. In terms of tangible actions, I think in my statement, which I will be more than happy to put out in the public domain, I mentioned very clear actions, and there's a review, that urgent review that's being that started, but things around the website, improved communications, quicker changes. The gyratory has been a pain for myself. I'm really frustrated that the changes haven't been made already on something we, as you said, Councillor Garrett, we agreed on. We need to get more reassurances from our contractor that they can make changes quicker. I just wanted to reassure everyone that the schemes didn't come out of thin air. We woke up in June and said what road closures and what low traffic neighborhoods are we gonna bid for. The majority of these schemes were already being developed, some more than others. We had already, for example, in the Sutton area, bid £7 million of livable neighborhood bid funding from TfL, and we were waiting for the results. We had 2 quiet ways, which we were sort of blending into low traffic neighborhoods, where we have secured funding. We had secured funding before COVID already. And others, as I said in my statement, were historical areas where we know there's issues and there's been a lot of complaints. So the most difficult period, I think, was this summer. I think it was making sure that all the work to implement the schemes was done properly, and clearly there's things that need to be improved and lessons learned. I'm hoping that once the schemes are in place, we will need to focus a lot more on the monitoring, on making sure the data is accurate, making sure that we monitor resident feedback, and we're quick on our feet when we need to be. I don't want to get into the politics of this, but I think it's not entirely, I don't recognize that this cross-party support point. We had a good discussion at the last meeting, but as soon as the schemes were in the public domain, I think the opposition, as every opposition in London, has spotted an opportunity regardless of the merits of the scheme. It's been fascinating seeing the transformation of opposition members supportive, then getting colder and colder and colder feet as the weeks go ahead because they see a political opportunity. I'm afraid when you run a council, you have to take decisions, you have to trial things that are not always popular, and but there are clear benefits if we get them right, that's why it's important that we see the impact on the ground of these schemes. And I can reassure anyone listening that these are trials, and we will be making amendments and removing any schemes that do not work. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to the debate on the 1st of October, where some of the petitioners will be addressing the committee, and we'll have a chance, I think, to discuss in much more detail the specifics of each scheme, the merits, and get feedback from councillors as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Abelan. That brings us to the end of this meeting. Can I thank everyone for your work this evening and draw this meeting to an end? Thank you very much. Goodbye.